Dear church, let's talk Greek. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley. Excited about my guest today. Dr. Jesse Robertson is joining us all the way from Searcy, Arkansas, professor at Harding University. Jesse, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us.
I'm glad you asked me, Chris. I'm glad to talk with you today.
Absolutely. I first came across Dr. Robertson. My son was at Harding, and it was Parents' Weekend, homecoming weekend. My wife and I went down to visit him, and one of the perks for Parents' Weekend was you got to go and sit in on a class, and it was your class that we sat in on, and I was really impressed. I think the class was maybe Life of Christ. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but
that's probably right. Probably so.
Excellent class. I know my son raved about it and really enjoyed it. And so from that point on, I've been trying to figure out a way to get you on here. And this subject matter that we're talking about today is one that, quite honestly, for me is a little intimidating, and I think it is for a lot of folks. And so you have the unenviable task, I guess, of trying to make it a little a little less cumbersome. But hey, before we jump in, though, tell us a little bit about what's going on in your world, how the semester's going, and also about your family.
Yeah, we're getting close to the end. So next week will be our Thanksgiving break. So students are huffing and puffing and getting stuff done, but I think we're still learning, so that's good. So that's, it's that time of the semester. I'm married to Kayla. Next month will be 33 years. We have 3 children and 3 grandchildren. We still have 1 child at home who's about to graduate from Harding Academy. And so that's what's going on at home. And around here, it's really just trying to help students complete their assignments and finish up stuff for the semester, really, at this point.
Yeah, and so in addition to your busy schedule as a professor, you're also active at the Cloverdale Church, from what I understand, and I know you're teaching Bible class there a lot. Are you serving as a shepherd as well? Do I have that correct? Or
Yep, that's news to me. That's just this year. We've been there pretty much since we moved to Searcy 7 years ago, and I'm new to being an elder there and been teaching. I fill in preaching every once in a while there and occasionally do interim preaching for some church within driving distance that might need somebody to help them while they look for a real preacher, so I do that sometimes.
Yeah. So full schedule. And, this is exciting for me because while I am I guess, semi-serious student when it comes to the Greek language. It's complicated, obviously, but I really enjoy studying it. Talk a little bit about when you approach it in a classroom setting. What is your goal? What are you trying to reach when you do elementary Greek with students? I mean, is there a place you want to get them to? Kind of what is your strategy?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we begin at the beginning. We assume no knowledge of Greek. So a person could come in never even having studied another foreign language and be ready to just start. And we'll start with the basics. I mean, the first assignment will be learn the alphabet. And we teach them to use the alphabet song. There are a lot of those out there online. I can sing it to 2 or 3 different tunes if they really want to hear that. But we start with the basics. But we also begin with kind of a promise that if students will do what we ask them to do, by the middle of the spring semester, we'll be reading long stretches from the Bible itself. And we, in general, we have not yet failed to deliver on that promise. It's usually something either in the early chapters of John or 1 John. Several semesters, we've managed to translate an entire book by the end of the second semester. So here, the standard requirement is 3 semesters, so 2 semesters of introductory grammar and a 3rd semester of reading. But we're usually doing quite a bit of reading by that second semester. So that's our goal, is to be at a point where we could read some of the simpler parts of the New Testament, which tend to be the writings of John, to read some of those with help. You'll have your textbook there to look up charts and tables of things you might need to know. You can use a dictionary and so on. But that's when students begin to get excited about what they're doing. And we are already, some of our exercises are sentences out of the New Testament. But when you really get where you can take the training wheels off, that's when it gets exciting.
Yeah. So what are some of the basics? So if we're launching into a study of Greek, what are some of the basics? You mentioned the alphabet. What are some other basics that we need to get down before we really can get into reading full sentences?
So, of course, the building blocks of every language are words. So we have vocabulary building that we do. We learn about 15 words a week in elementary Greek. And over the course of the whole year, you wind up with a vocabulary of 250, 300 words, which is a good start. And then, of course, those words have different categories. So nouns and verbs. And Greek is what we call a highly inflected language. And what that means is that the endings change depending on how the word is used. So that's one of the first things we do is we learn a basic vocabulary word. Let's take the word for human being or man or person, anthropos. And that's the form of the word you would use if it's the subject of a sentence. But if it's the direct object, the last letter changes. So it's the same word, recognizable. So we have to learn that. And then verbs, when they change tense, we have to learn about that. So we do that in English and not exactly the same way, but to some extent. If I want to say, instead of I stop, I stopped, well, I had the ED at the end. So we're learning how in this other language, the words are inflected or endings change. Sometimes the beginnings change. So that's really what it becomes about, is learning a little bit of that at the time, a little bit of vocabulary each week, and a few ways in which these words change their form so that we can recognize the function. So that's Greek is not particularly more complicated than other ancient languages, comparable to Latin in this kind of inflection that I'm talking about. But it is still the case that it does the same things we do, but it does them a little differently. So that's what we start building into.
What do you see as maybe in your personal study or with the students? What do you see as like the biggest hurdle? Like what's the most difficult part about learning this language?
I think of hurdles with Greek in two ways. One, learning how to learn a language. So I'll start with that one. If a student has learned any other second language before, then they've probably already got some skills. They've learned that language doesn't always work exactly the same way in order to say the same thing. If they've even just learned Spanish, which is pretty common, that people have studied a little Spanish in high school, they've learned a few things about inflection and a little bit about having gendered nouns, masculine, feminine, neuter, that sort of thing. So helping them learn the skills for how to learn a language, like to see how language functions. We spend a lot of time learning English in Greek class.
Really?
Oh, yes. Well, just imagine the first time we say, which is probably in the second week of class, now this form of this word is used for the direct object. And people say, direct object? I remember someone mentioned that somewhere along the way. Or we'll say, this can be used for a predicate nominative. Oh, wait a minute. Did we ever talk about that? I tell them that if they had an English teacher who was old school, a little bit mean, and made them diagram sentences and memorize principal parts of verbs, they'll be writing them a thank you letter. But apparently those kinds of teachers are fewer and further between. So we do a lot of English learning. So that would be all under the umbrella of sort of the biggest hurdle grammatically, is just learning how to learn a language, how language functions. But that leads to the second sort of hurdle, if you will, and that's breaking with overly simplistic models of how we think about language and coming to a healthier, more mature accurate one. Maybe all of us have heard somebody say along the way, I just want a translation that's word for word. Tell me the English equivalent of the Greek word and give me that. And after about half a semester of Greek, everyone is dispelled of that too simplistic idea. One word in Greek may require 3 words in English to convey all of the meaning by the time you get all the prefixes and suffixes attached to it. But that's why language learning is still for us so important. I know a lot of Greek students will, when they get done, they'll be glad they can operate a little bit in Greek, but they won't use it very much. Others will really love it and continue to use it a lot. But even if they're not translating every week, they have been transformed in their understanding of how language works. And that really helps us avoid a lot of problems in interpreting the Bible.
Yeah, and I want to kind of get to that because there's all these questions from the average person in a church building that is opening their Bible for Bible class or following along in the sermon. What version is the best? And we had Dr. Doug Burleson on here not long ago to talk about that. So we talk about Bible translations, word for word versus thought for thought, and all that. And one of the things that I've picked up along the way is that there's really not any version, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that can truly be word for word in every instance because, we have sayings like it's raining cats and dogs, that's not a Greek saying. And so there's not a literal word for word translation to convey that. But when you look at translating, obviously there's difficulty in that. Sometimes we just do the best we can with what we have, right?
Well, I suppose that's true, but in more than 99% of the cases of the words in the New Testament, we have abundant evidence of how the word is used, what its range of meaning is, and how that range is nuanced according to context. Occasionally, we run into a word that only occurs once. We refer to those as hapax legomena. And then we're like, okay, what does this mean? And we really heavily depend on the context. But that is extremely rare, actually. After all, Greek is used not only in the New Testament. We also had a translation of the Old Testament into Greek a couple of centuries before the time of Jesus. So we have all of that material using a lot of the same vocabulary. And then we have the entire Greek world going back at least to the 8th century BC in Homer, and Greek literature has always been in production. I mean, they spoke Greek in Greece 800 years before Christ, and they've been speaking some dialect of Greek there ever since. So we have a lot of comparative material. There are not very many places, and not any that I know of as like some critical doctrinal matter hanging on it, where we're just completely at a loss.
Yeah, good point. So, you were very kind there to say, I suppose that's true. You can go ahead and tell me if I'm just an imbecile and don't know what I'm talking about.
No. There are a few places where we have a few puzzles, no doubt, but it's far and away in the other direction with confidence.
Yeah. You mentioned context. I know that's, in what little study I've done of the language, that seems to be a big, and really in hermeneutics in general. I mean, context means everything, right? We say in real estate, location, location, location. In hermeneutics, it's context, context, context. When we come to the Greek language, so much of it does depend on context, right? I mean, and like you said, not just the one word that's mentioned one time, but also, I mean, isn't that true for any word, as we have to consider the context surrounding it in order to get because it seems like there's several Greek words that can mean different things based on the context, or am I completely off on that?
No, you said it exactly right, that a word is varied in meaning depending on its context. And that's true not only in Greek, it's true in every language, including English. So that's part of what we haven't thought about because we live with it in English And when we start doing it in a different language, any other language, it would be true, but it's certainly true in Greek. That's when it becomes clear to us that words have a range of meaning, and the context is sort of the range finder. It like narrows it down. If you go to an English dictionary and look up the word fly, you will find probably at least 20 different definitions with wide range in meaning, from an insect to the way the ball is hit in a certain time in baseball, to what you do on an airplane, to what a bird does. And what an airplane does and a bird does are not exactly the same thing. And there are many nuances in between. But you have probably never in your life misunderstood the word fly when it was used in a sentence. Context is that powerful. So when at first we begin to memorize Greek words and we say, well, it can mean this or this, a student who hasn't experienced another language before may be a little uneasy. But by the time we've worked with it for a semester or two, it becomes clear. And it really, again, is helpful in the maturing process. Teachers and preachers use words a lot. A great part of theology is word care, choosing the right word, using it the right way in a context, or reading a word correctly, paying attention to the context. So that's just such a really powerful thing that you said there about words and the importance of context.
Yeah, and along with that, tenses seem to be a big deal in the Greek language, which, like you just said, I mean, it is in any language, certainly in the English language.
Right.
The tense, we hear a lot about present indicative and the aorist and all of that. Not to get too deep into that, but, when we talk about context, we're also talking about tenses because, we hear terms like punctiliar versus linear and things of that nature. And that can really be overwhelming at times. So talk a little bit about the tense of a word and how that makes such a difference in the context as well.
Yes, it does. And the context makes a difference on the tense as well.
Yeah.
So, for example, just the present tense in Greek can be simple or progressive. One spelling in Greek, and whether it's simple or progressive is a matter of thinking about the context and what's appropriate. So, for example, we could, let me think of a word. Let's just say a word for love, agapao, I love. That word, agapao, can be translated I love or I am loving. And you might think, well, there's not much difference there. And there's not, but there could be a subtle difference. So we might express it as a simple present. I love God, and it's just kind of a universal statement. It's like a statement that just applies across my life, right? But if I say I am loving God, suddenly you're drawn a little more into the action a little bit. Like, okay, that's happening now. Or if I say I preach, you might say, oh, that's his occupation or something that he does occasionally. But if I say I am preaching, you might say, oh, right now? Right? Am I interrupting you? Did I call you or text you in the middle of a sermon? Or maybe you mean you have a regular engagement. It's in progress, so it's progressive. So on the one hand, tenses do help us understand how the action is being described, depicted, or even happening. But even those tenses have something to do with context. What's the context in which a particular tense is used? Because even one tense can be used with more than one nuance of meaning. So one of the things that is sometimes misused as people who maybe have a little bit of Greek, and as my old Greek professor said, a little Greek is a dangerous thing. That sometimes they'll say, "Oh, this tense means this." Well, it means that, and another thing, and maybe one other thing. So that's within the range of it. But what does the context mean? Is this an action that's in progress, or more of global universal statement. So even there, we keep coming back to the word context. I tell my students that half the time in class, the answer to the question I'm asking you is context.
Context, yeah. Yeah, I like that. So do you think that's why there's so much maybe difficulty today, and even you see it in our culture, in our church culture, trying to maybe get around certain doctrines of Scripture that maybe seem too restrictive? And well, I'll just throw it out there. One of them that I encounter quite often now is the homosexuality issue, and getting around that issue by saying, well, 1 Corinthians 6, that homosexual really doesn't mean that, or and do you think that that's kind of what this is stemming from, is that they're taking a nuance of that word that's not really fitting of the context?
One of the ways that we get at truth, learn new truth, or defend truth that we already hold as a belief is really going back to language, looking at context, but also how words are used in multiple contexts. So a strategy, if a person doesn't like the way a text is being interpreted or thinks a text is being misinterpreted, is to go back and say, well, does that word mean what you're telling me that it means? As far as the strategy goes, everyone who cares deeply about Bible study probably raises that question, right? Maybe someone else is making it say something that I don't like, or maybe I'm telling them it says something that they don't like. And so the motivation might be, what do I like? But we could get past that and say, what does it actually mean? So we might go to a standard lexicon, which usually is done by multiple people, and look and see how they have discerned the range of meaning of that word. And most good lexicons are pretty thick because they give examples. So a lexicon, a Greek dictionary, is really a collection of examples of where that word was used, and then organized in such a way as to say, okay, these 3, 4, or 10 examples seem to be using it where it would be translated as preach. But here in these other examples, it's not quite a religious context, so maybe it means proclaim. And maybe over here it means announce, and they collect examples. So, all of us should be trying to root our understanding in reality and good evidence. And so that's where we have the opportunity to say, whatever interpretation a person is giving, what's your evidence and how did you get there? And sometimes, unfortunately, we discern that people are more motivated by what they wanted to say than what it actually says.
Yeah, good point. I like the way you phrase that. Let me ask you this. I've heard many times over, and I'm sure you have as well, well, you don't have to be a Greek scholar to learn the Bible, and totally agree with that statement. However, as a minister and even as a Bible student, I have learned over the years that, man, knowing some Greek, especially in certain instances, can really clear up some confusion. I think about baptism, being immersion. I think about some other words that have really kind of cleared it up for me once I understood what the meaning was. What would you say to that when somebody says, you don't have to be a Greek scholar to understand the Bible? But I think, I'm guessing you would agree that knowing some Greek is very helpful in Bible study.
Well, in the Greek classroom, we have a sense of humor all our own. And you're just reminding me that I'll tell students, you don't have to know Greek to go to heaven, but why take a chance, right? And they appreciate that. But of course you don't. I mean, some people are illiterate and don't read anything and are still terrific Christians. And that's been true century after century.
Sure.
You might think of it this way. How much medical knowledge does a person need to have in order to be healthy? Well, it sort of depends on what's going on. Most days, just some basic knowledge is all you need. You trust your physician. Maybe you're doing first aid with the kids at home and putting on Band-Aids and washing your hands with soap and water, and maybe that's enough. But if a person is going to put themselves in the position of giving medical advice to other people, a little more might be expected. Sure. And if a person is going to be a leader in a business, do we expect them to know a little more about accounting and budgets or sales and management and business strategy than just the person who is doing their job, very important job, but it doesn't require the same broader knowledge. So it depends on what one's trying to do. And I do think that for people who are going to try to lead and teach, I mean, the Bible itself does give us some warning that if we're going to take responsibility of teaching and leading, that we don't want to be the blind leading the blind. And so at least some awareness of how language works, and some basic ability to use some Greek and Hebrew tools seems wise for those who are going to be teaching and preaching a good bit and making maybe bolder claims or be asked to be a resource person for some of the more challenging issues that come up.
Yeah, very well said. Hey, Jesse, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been enlightening. I can geek out on this stuff all day.
It's been a pleasure, Chris.
Yeah, I want to tell our listeners and viewers that if you have a specific question about today's episode, please send an email my way at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. If you have a specific question for Dr. Robertson, we will forward it to him, and I'm sure he'd be glad to entertain it. We just thank you all for tuning in. Jesse, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us. We really appreciate it.
Okay, had a lot of fun, Chris. Thank you.
Yes, I did too. Thank you all for tuning in. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.